Thank you for joining us today on 10 Minutes with the Artist, an episodic series that explores the art practice and the personal vision that guides artists. On today's episode, we're very proud to have Robbie Darling, who's completing his thesis in architecture at North Dakota State University. We invited him here today to speak about his research and the creation of artifacts in preparation for his defense. Robbie's work explores how the public spaces we occupy are affected by the past. His explorations touch on situation, remembrance, and the lessons we can learn from ruin and idyllic expectations. I'm Anthony Ferris, and this is 10 Minutes with the Artist. Thank you, Robbie, for joining us today on 10 Minutes with the Artist. I was wondering how the absence of something can speak powerfully toward that thing.
Sure. So when there's an absence of something, but it's evident that something was still there in the first place, then that can kind of evoke what used to be there in a way that's maybe more tangible than just having the old thing there in the first place. When something just kind of only has a trace behind, then it leaves a lot of room for interpreting. Even if you have all the facts, there's still some interpretation as to what was actually there and how it was experienced.
I was curious why, how the radios sort of connect to building material.
Sure. Radios don't maybe directly one-to-one relate with building materials. It's not like the radios represent wood beams or something, but more kind of the experience of what it might be like in a building, just kind of in a historical and even a little more directly in an acoustical sense. When one of those historical radios is turned on and the vacuum tubes start humming, it's sort of akin to like opening up a channel to the past, and also kind of like faintly relates to maybe like an AC system running or something like that. That hum of the radio relates to the hum of when the heat gets turned on, something like that.
Are there any sort of connections to like the public and the private sphere, and also like history in a way?
Yeah, definitely. The public, as we know it today, is completely separate as to what it was, say, 500 years ago. And in that, public was treated much more differently by society, especially with the different classes of people and everything. And over time, public space has gone from a space of kind of activation of what people are doing in a given space. You have the kind of public squares that were typical of your medieval European towns and that kind of thing, and compare that to like a huge intersection at like 13th Avenue by the mall or something. You have that same sort of allocation of space, except it's just an intersection. It's not like a public space. And the way that type of thing interacts with the private sphere has also changed as well. You look at how one enters a home nowadays. There's a garage in front a lot of the times, and then you walk in through that and get there, and it used to be much more private. You'd always enter in from an alley. So the way that someone interacts with a public and private space, and looking at how, obviously interacting with a public square is a lot more pleasant than interacting with a public intersection of massive roads, and kind of channeling that aspect and making good public spaces that interact well with the private spaces in like the typology of an apartment building is something that's very important, I feel.
Well, since your work has to do with public housing sites, I was curious what the difference is between a public square and a public housing unit.
Sure, yeah. So they both have public in the word, but one is a public square and one is a private dwelling. And a public a person acts differently in a public space than they would in their own home. That's just kind of a fact of life, and the way you mediate the way somebody acts between a given space, or rather that you invite somebody to act in a given space is very important, I guess. And allowing for somebody to act in a way that isn't very constricting and treating it like a box for people storage or something.
Well, there's this thing that happens in a lot of the public housing that I think you're talking about and addressing, which is that there is a private dwelling, but there's also public spaces within it that affect and negatively affect, I think, the private spaces in it. So there's this overlap. And the spaces that you're talking about, I'm feeling like they're not ideal public housing spaces, right? And why are they not?
Yeah, historically, and specifically with the case of Pruitt-Igoe, a public housing development in St. Louis, when you have these public spaces, you have to be really careful how you manage them. For example, if you make them very, very large and have all of the dwellings connected to that large space, then you have 50 people sharing a public space, and when something goes bad with it, nobody really feels the inclination to fix it because, well, it's not my problem. 50 other people are here with me. As opposed to, say, like a smaller space where only 2 apartments are sharing like a little public landing, and something goes wrong with that, then somebody will feel a little more inclination to keep it up. And that's especially important in public housing because, in Pruitt-Igoe especially, because mechanical or the maintenance people weren't really paid for all that much. You can blame a lot of that on the city, and so that's what caused it all to go into such crazy disrepair. And so the way you manage the size and the adjacencies of public spaces has a lot to do with the success and how good a space feels in a public housing development.
When is history like a positive and a negative thing when dealing with buildings or objects?
I would say history has a lot to say, and how you celebrate it or recognize it can show what has happened in space and make the space richer because of it. If you have, say, the ruins of a warehouse building, which are very popular nowadays for renovating and turning into apartments, expressing all of the old details and that kind of thing, and the stuff that you don't see built anymore, that's one way to really positively show what history can do. And at the same time, if you're at the site of a tragedy, like with Pruitt-Igoe, then it's important not to replicate all the bad things that have happened there or any of the bad spaces, but to just recognize them and show them that, yes, it happened, and yes, we have to recognize it, and here's how we're going to move forward, and having that kind of juxtaposition between, for lack of a better term, old and bad and good and new.
Well, can you tell the viewers at home how they resolved the issue of that unit in St. Louis?
Well, how they resolved it is it was built in the 50s, lasted for about 20 years, and then in the 70s, it had gotten so bad that they just decided to explode all of it. So, well, they imploded the one building and brought down the rest of them with a wrecking ball, and now all that's left is some buried rubble and trees.
Okay. We always like to leave on a high note here. Can you, we're going to ask a few questions about your creative practice, if that's okay.
Sure.
So what time of day do you feel like you're most creative?
Ooh, I would say probably 11 p.m. or midnight.
Okay. And do you listen to music or anything like that while you're making your work?
Absolutely, yeah. Usually it's non-instrumental stuff. If I have to think really heavy about something, I don't like to jam out when I'm trying to get my creative things going. So I listen to like jazz, Miles Davis, and then even like lots of lower tempo EDM. A whole lot of variety, but usually no words.
Okay. And is there anything that you're reading right now?
I just picked up Dune by Frank Herbert,
Okay.
science fiction book, and I hope it's going to be good.
Oh, that is very good. And then I guess my last question would be, what's next for you?
Completing the thesis, getting all the drawings done, and then I have a job offer I've just accepted in Minneapolis at CMA. So I look forward to moving there in June.
Okay, well, congratulations, Robbie. And I'd like to thank our guest. And I'd also like to thank you all for your time and your interest in the professional practice and the creative explorations happening here at North Dakota State University. So thank you very much. And for everyone here at the Memorial Union Gallery, keep creative.